Good evening, everyone. My goodness, I haven't seen some of you I've never seen. So it's nice to meet you, sort of. And so many of you I haven't seen in months because I sort of disappeared while you were all on Ongo. And I see lots of longer hair than the last time I was here. So my name is Soten. I'm a senior student here at the Village Zendo. I've been a senior student. No, I've been a student for 33 years. As as a friend of mine likes to point out, by the time Mozart was my age, he was dead. Jesus too. For 33 years, never mind. Okay. What I want to talk about has been evolving since I gave my last Dharma talk. Normally, I like to sort of follow the Zen approach of a Dharma talk should be spontaneous and it shouldn't be overly planned, certainly not weeks or a couple of months in advance. But the last Dharma talk I gave sort of triggered a bunch of stuff that while all of you have been on Ongo, this has been my version of Ongo. And in part, it's been a little bit of a cauldron on my side of things because the hospital that I work in woke back up and things are kind of back to normal, except that it's anything from normal. So we're doing everything we've always done, except not quite the same. So this has all been playing out for me in that context, which has given it a certain urgency and has also been a good distraction. It's good to become obsessive with one thing when something else is so upsetting. And then you just be distracted by this thing over here, which I found has been a good strategy for dealing with COVID for me. And what I started to realize a few weeks ago is that what I'm talking about kind of is the notion of blind spots, my own blind spots, which are very, very specific to me. But I started to think that perhaps in exploring, maybe in more than usual detail for a Dharma talk, some of my own specifics, more than I usually would, that maybe there were some generalizable principles or ideas here that many of you might find useful or interesting. If you want to know most concretely how a blind spot functions, the blind spot means that part of your vision that is missing because your optic nerve enters your retina. And so there's no perception in that little zone. And yet your brain makes up for that. So in ordinary life, you don't perceive it. And if you want to experience your blind spot, Google demonstrating your blind spot or something similar. And there are lovely little things you can do that will pop up on your screen and will show you, let you directly experience your blind spot. But the thing is, how do you know you have a blind spot if you're blind to it? And that sort of has been what my experiences over the last couple of months have been. It was triggered, as I said, by something I brought up in my last Dharma talk a couple of months ago. That Dharma talk was on the koan Book of Serenity, case number 36, Master Ma is unwell. And I'll just sort of blitz through it quickly. Master Ma was unwell. The monastery superintendent asked, Master, how is your venerable state these days? And he happened to be dying, actually, in the setting of this story. The great teacher said, sun-faced Buddha, moon-faced Buddha. And I explored the koan in terms of how what we conceive of as the absolute versus the relative, the sun versus the changeable moon, but in fact, it's one light streaming over both of them. And yet one is absolute golden and clear and stable, and the other is ever changing. But they are not two, even though they might seem it. And the verse gives examples of how, again, the way I unpacked it was in terms of how the relative and the absolute relate to each other. The mirror faces forms without subjectivity. a perfect mirror that's free of dust or blemish or defect, which side is the real, which is the reflection? Impossible to say. The pearl in a bowl rolls itself. A perfectly smooth pearl in a perfectly smooth silver bowl, there's no friction. What's going to slow it down? It's just going to keep going round and round and round between the two of them. Don't you see before the hammer gold refined 100 times? Gold is gold, and yet we hammer it into something that has a form, and yet it's still that 100 times refined gold. And the final sentence, and this is sort of the final verse, under the scissors, silk from one loom. And this made me think about my dad, who was a cutter. That was his trade. And he was in the rag business. And how you take this vast, endless, shining sheet of silk emerging from a loom, and you cut it into pieces to make whatever you're going to make. It's still that shining silk that's pouring out from the loom, and yet we make form. And in the middle of my talk, at that point, it made me think of something that had happened to me a few weeks before. I was on this panel for this conference online as one of two scientists questioning a woman who is felt by many people to be some kind of enlightened being. And during the course of her describing what it is like to be enlightened, she said if we wanted to experience the primordial light of the universe and the primordial sound of the universe, we could close our eyes with our fingers, and the lights that we would see are the primordial light. And if we then bring our thumbs to close our ears, that sound is the primordial sound that in Vedic traditions they label Om. And I thought that was kind of astonishing, because to me, that was just the way my photons, the way my retina fires in the absence of photons. And I thought, well, that sound, that's just sort of the air passing over my eardrum and the sound of my blood rushing through. I never thought about it as primordial anything. But what it really made me realize that I had never thought before is that when I practice shikantaza, and I'm trying to, in that practice, have open present awareness, as we say, open presence awareness, where we are not choosing our sensory inputs, clinging to them, or shying away from them, just being present to how they're changing moment by moment. I had always excluded those particular sensory inputs because I thought they were just physiological things. And so I had cut that silk in this particular way to draw boundaries around my experience that I wasn't even aware that I was doing. And over the subsequent weeks since I gave that talk, I've sort of been practicing with when I'm sit and sort of go into a shikantaza-like attempted practice, I start with listening for those and watching for those. Because if I don't include them, I know I'm picking and choosing. This was all going on in parallel with something else that I wound up, some of the Zen teachers in the room at the moment will know that this is stuff I brought up in Dokusan. So I have this weird collagen defect. Many of you who have known me and been at the Zendo for many years know that periodically I show up in a brace or with a cane or with a limp or all various sorts of things. I'm either breaking or healing from something broken. And the reason is I have this weird sort of collagen. It's a syndrome called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I seem to be a new mutation in my family. And my collagen is sort of lax. So my ligaments and tendons are lax. This is my normal baseline. This is what I grew up with. I didn't know that, in fact, I wasn't diagnosed until my 30s. I didn't know that there was anything abnormal, but it was already in there from the very beginning, because if you look at children who have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, they don't tend to crawl on all fours. because their limbs can't stabilize to get into the all fours position because their tendons and ligaments are loose. So for me, I pulled myself along on my elbows like a Marine. We have home movies of me doing this. Some kids roll to get where they're going. Some scoot along on their butts. And then by the time you get to be old enough to walk, you have tightened up your body sufficiently that when the walking signals start, you're suddenly walking. And so a lot of us wind up having very rigid, tense bodies. I wasn't aware that this was an issue. My parents weren't aware it was an issue. But already looking back now, I realized there was some subtle aspect to, I can't trust my body. There was a period of time for about a year where I was trying to get on all fours because that's what my brain, the signals my brain was sending, and it wasn't happening. I couldn't get into that position. But this was invisible to me because this is just my normal state. I didn't have anyone to compare it to. My parents didn't have anyone to compare it to. Growing up, that led to physical issues that to me just meant, okay, the world is divided into jocks and nerds and those rare golden people who are both jocks and nerds, and then the people who just aren't quite either. And that's the way the universe in West Hartford, Connecticut was constructed as far as I was concerned. And I was on the nerd side because that's what I was. I didn't realize that there was something going on here. My favorite, I'm going to drop a name, my favorite movie critic is David Edelstein, until recently, of the New Yorker, New York Magazine. If you know him, he's a great movie critic. We were on a bowling team together when I was a kid, and he always made fun of me for moving like a penguin, which I really didn't understand. I was reminded of this about 8 years ago, and this is so vivid in my mind. I was walking in Paris, it was summer, I was in shorts and a t-shirt, and everyone was sort of casual, and I was feeling really relaxed, and I was in the gay section of town, so guys were looking at each other. And there was this cute guy ahead of me who caught my eye and I caught his eye. And then he started making fun of how I was walking. And I was just like, whoa, I didn't realize until it was, you know, suddenly there was the mirror. I was diagnosed, like I said, in my 30s. And one of the things I did was go start a yoga practice. And this was hugely helpful to me in trying to figure out how to both loosen my body to some extent at the same time as stabilizing it. One of the things I discovered through that, though, and I still have not really got a grip on, is that I really never knew how to breathe. I watch my husband, who's quite a yogi, and he breathes with his movement. When I move, I stop breathing until the movement's over, and then I can breathe again. And no matter how many times yoga teachers have said you're not breathing, I just. And there's been a similar thing in my Zen practice with this. Over the years, I've heard all of our teachers at one point or another talk about locating how they feel, how we feel in our bodies, being present to the sensations in our bodies when we are having an experience. And I always hear that, and it's a little bit like white noise or the lights behind my eyelids. I don't know what they're talking about. I remember one time, Enkyo Roshi said something about this, and I took a taxi back from the Zendo to home, and it was a rainy night, and the taxi was speeding, and I was really kind of afraid of the way he was driving and hesitant to say, could you please slow down? And I thought to myself, I should do what she said. I should see how I'm feeling. And I had no idea how to locate that. I was telling a friend of mine about this a few weeks ago, not particularly apropos of Zen. And they said, yeah, you know, I recently had an experience like this too. I've been with the same psychiatrist for 30 years, therapist, I don't know if it's a psychiatrist, for 30 years. And she said to me, as she often does, well, what kind of feelings are you having? And he said to me, it was this revelation. For the first time, he realized feelings are something you feel. It's not a mind state, it's a feeling. A few months ago, I was in an early morning yoga workshop at a conference. Eddie Stern was giving a thing, and he's a marvelous teacher. And I never take a yoga class from anyone new because I'm afraid I might break, because I often do. But he was like, I promise to watch out for you and be gentle. And he was wonderful, and I got through it without hurting myself. But the end, he had us go into Shavasana, lying flat on the ground. And then he asked us to locate our heartbeats. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting idea. So I was lying there without like putting your hand on your heart. Afterwards, I went up to him and I said, can people really do that? He said, what do you mean? I said, feel your heart just lying there. He goes, you couldn't? Again, blind spot. My heart is in a blind spot that it didn't even occur to me to look for the sensation of my heart. I still haven't found it, but I'm working on it. But all of this came together. Here we're finally getting to the point. In my Zen practice. So yoga, physical therapy for the last 6 years, twice a week because of my injuries. Started doing Tai Chi 2 years ago, and my Tai Chi teacher was always like, you look like you're moving concrete. Could you move like maybe you're holding a baby? Learning to sort of let go. He gave me Qigong practices where he had me hold weights to tell my body how to drop. And I suddenly realized about 2 or 3 months ago that I have never sat in Zazen without my legs and my butt tight. I hold myself up on the cushion by tensing all of that. That's my normal baseline. So I thought, okay, try to release it. And I couldn't. So I spent a couple of months. I got 3-pound weights and 5-pound weights, and I had the 3-pound weights in my hands and the 5-pound weights on my thighs, sitting there like I was doing in Tai Chi, trying to learn to drop my body. And it started to happen. I don't use the weights anymore, though I still have to remind myself to do it. So what have I been doing for 33 years? What kind of Zazen have I had? Sitting with my body tense all the time. And part of this is a reflection of why I came into Zen practice in the first place. 33 years ago, I went to Zen Mountain Monastery for an intro weekend because I had read about Zen a whole bunch, and I was looking for something that was transcendent, that would take me over and beyond the things that I perceived as constraining myself, most of which I conceived of as one form of suffering or another. And what I wanted to get was Kensho, very specifically. I wanted to have one sudden leap into some kind of freedom that I couldn't even imagine, but people told me it existed out there. And I quickly learned that this was not the right way to think, because we aren't here to gain anything. We have this kind of non-practice practice where, you know, the paradox of striving for not striving. Me trying to relax on my cushion, which I just can't do, but I'm learning. In our study text, this Ango, painting of a rice cake, as everyone, we've all heard it over and over again. Dogen writes this: just as reaching does not make one thing separate, it does not make one thing not separate. To try to make it not different is a hindrance. When you allow reaching to be unhindered by reaching, one reaching is myriad reaching. One reaching is one thing. Reaching one thing is reaching myriad things. So in part, he's pointing to what lies beyond the pointing, beyond the striving, beyond the reaching. And that's really wonderful if we want to have a discussion, an encounter with the notion of what we sometimes in English call enlightenment and the absolute. But he also teaches elsewhere that sometimes it is just merely about this right here, right now, Not something fancy like Tensho and freedom and enlightenment, but one's own body, one's own feelings, one's own posture, one's own sensorium and cognitive capacities, one's own psychological structures, one's own psychological strictures. And how often do we simply not even know that our limitations exist, because this right here, as we are and have been, are all we know. None of us have anyone else's experience to compare ourselves to, unless you happen to be walking down the street in Paris and someone makes fun of you. We're blind to these things unless we look for them. But how can you look for something that you're blind to? That old search for transcendence that brought me ultimately to Zen was driven by sufferings born of limitations. Being gay in a straight family, being a child of a Holocaust survivor, having a body that was deeply unworthy of trust. I wasn't only physically a mess, but psychologically a mess. And the pressures of med school, thank God, finally drove me to analysis for 4.5 years, 5 times a week on the couch. And then often on psychotherapy for 20 years, sometimes once a week, sometimes twice a week. What would my Zen practice be if I had only sought solutions for these things on the cushion? I think to myself, how much clawing through of all that I would have to do just sitting here, and how much would I have managed to claw through? Perhaps sitting in shikantaza for hours, days, or years could have revealed them all, and they all would have just dissolved away. Perhaps passing that 263rd koan could have lifted me up and over these limitations and constraints into some kind of freedom. Perhaps following my breath for 30 years, 33 years, might have taught me that I actually have a breath. But they didn't. I needed these other things to help me find my way through to my Zen practice. So at 33 years of being a Zen student, I find myself coming back to simply how to sit and how to breathe. I've sort of today just started thinking of this talk as, I used to give beginning instruction for about 7 or 8 years every Monday night. In fact, there are a few people in the room who I gave beginning instruction to, which always makes me feel sort of chuffed. And then I'd go into the details of how to sit, where to put your legs, where to put your knees, where to put your butt, where to put the tip of your tongue, where to put your gaze, how to lower your eyelids, in very, significant detail. And I started to feel like, oh, this is sort of beginning instruction 2.0 for myself, because it's all basically the same stuff. As I was discussing these, I brought this into, as I said, to Dokusan with a few of our teachers. And when I came to Enkyo Roshi to talk about it, and this attempt to try and relax my body, one of the things I mentioned was, do you really put the tip of your tongue behind your front teeth? Because somewhere I remember reading that that's really just to control your saliva flow. And she said, number one, yes, she does. Number two, well, who said that? You could also look at it as a way of directing the flow of your chi through your body. Oh, how non-pragmatic. Just like the lights behind my eyes might be the primordial light, and the sound of my ears might be the primordial sound, not merely the physiology of my ears and eyes. And it could be both, right? Not one, not two. And she also reminded me when we were talking about it that Zen practice isn't her only practice. She does yoga. She does Qigong. I'm watching her face to see whether she's approving of me revealing our Dokusan conversation. Oh, she's waving a finger. And I know she sees doctors even. She does all those things to support her life, but they also support her practice. One thing that she and I have in common, I know, is that over the years, our bodies have changed, and we're often catching up with those changes after they've happened, so that we're having a painful time sitting on our cushion and then discover, oh, you need to sit differently because you're older, your body has changed. The cushion needs to be a little higher, it needs to be a little lower, or maybe you should be in Seiza, that something needs to shift. How do you know? These are my blind spots. So to me now, thinking about all this, being a good Zen student, because I always desperately want to be a good Zen student, particularly for Agyurverji, it's more than just learning our practice and then doing it over and over the same way for years, expecting that it can do everything for us. It's being constantly on the lookout for our edges, our blind spots, those gaps or limitations that are so just the way I am that we don't even notice them. We've spent a lot of time in recent months discussing social versions of this in terms of systemic racism and unconscious bias. What about your unconscious biases about who you are and how you function physically and psychologically? Where are your blind spots in regard to your feelings, your physical body and space, your sensorial? And in an age where skillful means abound to address virtually anything you might discover, we shouldn't perhaps sit complacently on our cushion and expect our Zen practice to accomplish everything. We've got many things to bring in that can reinforce our practice as our practice reinforces our life. Dogen said to study Buddhism is to study ourselves is to forget ourselves. He didn't say to study Buddhism is to forget ourselves. There's that most difficult intermediate step of studying ourselves directly. And that means not only finding what we are, but trying to become aware of what we're not. Even though, how do you find that? So this summer, I learned how I had so much more to find in studying myself, not my mystical self, but just this, my body, my mind, my feelings, my emotions. And in so doing, I feel as though I've found freedoms to which I had no idea that I had access. My sitting in the last 2 months is something completely different than anything I've ever experienced before in all these years of Zen practice, because I learned to settle and pay attention. So if you watch me sitting on the cushion, you won't see any change at all, perhaps, beyond maybe a slight drop to my shoulders. But inside, the tip of my tongue is behind my front teeth. My eyes and ears are awake to sights and sounds they construct of their own accord. And my physical body is alive with some subtle energy that some people call chi. Very little is different, and everything has changed. So I'd ask each of us, myself included, because the work goes on, where are our blind spots? How does one find them? Can you find yours? And when we find them, can you be courageous on your own behalf to get help from within Zen practice, learning from our teachers, our Sangha mates, but also from outside of our Zen practice? For example, things I've mentioned and others, yoga, Tai Chi, Reiki, Alexander, Feldenkrais, Tai Chi, physical therapy, psychotherapy, and then unfurling all that we find there and learn about ourselves into our practices. Imagine what it would be like to practice Shikantaza, to solve a koan, to follow your breath. What kind of freedoms await us with a practice like that? I doubt any of us can fully imagine, but that's what our Zen practice